I appreciate your time. I appreciate everything you've done for me. I appreciate all the other cases you're managing, and hopefully we don't get a bill like that again. I mean, it's actually a lot of it's not even yours, and I know that you've done a lot of work for us, and it's really fair. And I think you've saved us a lot more than.
I think that's probably right. We probably overall, I think we're in front on the relationship, but still, look, I don't like to underestimate, but we did on this occasion. But it's something that's out of our hand. It was out of our hands in this case.
I'll tell you, our viewers, they're loyal, and they know that that if we're fighting it, win or lose, it's worth having. And I think it is. The fact that the government is so desperate to try stop little old me from holding him accountable in Parliament just shows how important it is to have that fight. My fellow rebels, I'm back here outside the Supreme Court of Victoria, where any day now, the judge is expected to hand down his ruling in my case to gain access to Daniel Andrews' press conferences. But the reason I'm today catching up with my lawyer and making this video is because I need your help. I really need your help again. I need you to dig deep and support me, because when we initially took up this fight, we were estimated between $80,000 to $100,000. But for reasons you're about to hear from our lawyer, that number has tripled.
The simple reason is the government fought it so hard. They got a QC in, so we had a couple of barristers and a team of lawyers from a private firm fighting us.
Even though the cost of this case blew out of expected proportions, it's still worth it. We've got to have these fights each and every time. Win some, lose some. We've certainly won some, but we need to have them. Otherwise, the government is never going to be held accountable. And the judgment, hopefully it comes through and we do win it, but I need your help. RVLegalFund.com. Please give what you can to ensure that we can have this fight, hopefully win this fight, and to live another day for the next fight. RVLegalFund.com. Every dollar counts.
It wasn't just the size of the team that they threw at us, but it was the arguments. They relied on a thing called exclusive cognizance of Parliament. This is something that comes from the Constitution from 100 years ago. It says the Parliament has the powers of the English House of Commons from 1865, and that was set up from cases going back into the 1700s. So we were literally going back and having to look at cases from hundreds of years ago and argue this idea, this concept of Parliament's exclusive cognizance, which means basically the courts can't actually influence what the Parliament does, and can't sit in judgment over the Parliament. So that was really the key thing. But then on every single argument, it became like a royal commission almost. We knew they weren't going to roll over easily, but we didn't realise how much they didn't want this decision-making process to be exposed and reversed.
I think many of the viewers would have gone, well, that would have been pretty naive to think that they weren't going to put everything at fighting little mean Avi. But just for people to understand, when we first drew up the estimate of what was involved with this, obviously you guys have a lot of experience with judicial reviews. What really did that look like compared to this?
Yeah, well, look, we probably we did underestimate. So we had less than $100,000 was our estimate, and I think we've doubled that, and then maybe
almost tripled,
maybe a bit more. Thanks for picking me up on that. So look, that's part of these things, and estimates are never absolute or guaranteed, but yeah, it was difficult. I mean, all the way. I mean, you sat next to me in court, and you saw the debating, if you like, on our side about how exactly we were going to put our case. So constantly, all the way through the case itself, we did all the work in preparation, but all the way through the case, we were off at lunchtime and then every evening doing research and arguing amongst ourselves about how best to present the case. So, with every move the government make this way, we've got to then counter that. It was just a classic case of underestimating the fight that was going to be put up on the other side, which means then we underestimated the total costs that we were going to incur.
Well, and when you compare that to the kind of judicial review that it was expected to be, compared to the argument they brought up, what was the picture? What did we envisage the fight was going to be about instead of this constitutional argument that they took it to?
Yeah, well, we expected the fight to be about the decision-making process. You know, what they didn't take into account, what they should have taken into account, and whether or not it was a good and fair process. Therefore, the decision, whether or not it was a correct decision. So that's a totally different argument. I mean, we were having that as well. But in addition to that, and totally separate and totally different to that, we're having this argument about constitutional powers of the Parliament versus the courts, and what Lord so-and-so said in the 1700s. And frankly, I don't think there would be a lawyer in Victoria who would say, I'm an expert in exclusive cognizance, the concept of exclusive. It's so rarely argued that what we all had to do was go back. We had to go back to school basically on this topic, and we were researching from a really low base of knowledge, really, about exactly how we were going to make this argument. So what that requires is everyone having to read these cases, and they're not easy cases to read. The Old English language isn't overly easy to read. So we're going back to the drawing board almost on this totally separate argument that, frankly, my view is, putting legal arguments aside for a moment, we just shouldn't be having. Forget those things. Was this a right decision, and was the process fair? That's what we should be arguing about. We're in 2022, but we've got no control over that. That's the argument the government put forward. We've got to meet that argument. And so that's why we had to go back to the drawing board and, school ourselves in exclusive cognizance, the concept.
Yeah, so in layman's terms, basically, we prepared initially for a judicial review for the court to determine whether it was a fair process and decision to have me banned from Parliament.
Yep.
But then what the government came back with was essentially lawfare. They wanted to make it as hard and as expensive as possible, so they've come back with this really hard, difficult part of the law in addition to the judicial review. So it wasn't in place of the judicial review. We had the argument of judicial fairness, and that's, from what I understand, there's two parts of the decision that have to come through. There's the judicial review itself, and then there's the whether the court had the jurisdiction, that extra argument. Is that right? Yeah,
that's right. You really only get to that first part you mentioned if you get past the jurisdictional point. If the court doesn't have jurisdiction, that's really the end of it. If the court has jurisdiction, then the court's got to decide the case. And it's not just complex and difficult area of the law. It's an ancient area of the law. I mean, I think that's the really, for me, interesting part of this, is that the government went back to what the powers of the English House of Commons had in 1865. And let's just say that again. We're talking about the powers that the English House of Commons had in 1865, and whether that stops a judge in 2022 in the Victorian Supreme Court saying anything about the decision that was made about who can enter the grounds of the Victorian Parliament. I mean, that on any view seems extraordinary to me, but that's the law, and that's what we had to argue. So so that's where we ended. And this is that's why this case was far more hard fought in terms of the time that it took for us to prepare and to argue the case than we expected.
At Rebel News, obviously, the way we fight all these cases, we crowdfunded this one off the estimate initially. We plan to pull $100,000 from my legal fund that's there for these kind of fights. Now that it's blown out, I think it's at 278 or somewhere around. That's almost 3 times. We're going to ask our viewers again to chip in and help pay for it, the balance here. Now, 2 questions. Some of them might ask, well, why bother using such an expensive QC to fight this and have such a large team? We had there was a whole team working on this for weeks. instead of just having, one solicitor and barrister fighting it? What would you say to those viewers?
Well, you've got to match firepower with firepower. There's no point going into a gunfight with a knife. So if you've got a QC who on the other side who's twisting and turning, you really want to be able to match that. And frankly, if you're not really doing that, why are you there? And that's, I think you'd be really wasting, even though you'd be saving money in some sense, you'd be really wasting that money. We've got a real shot of winning this. I hope that we do. I expect that we will. I think we should. Now, I'm not sure I'd be able to say that if we'd gone in underprepared, if it was just, little old me making the argument by myself up against a team of barristers and QCs. So, I think that's the short version on that.
Well, I think that's a great answer for those that didn't watch, especially the last 10 minutes, you and me sitting there. In the last 10 minutes of that case, I think it became quite clear why Will Horton is so good at his job. And I felt grateful, and I certainly think that from somebody that sat there and was throughout the process and has been in a number of legal battles till now, realising that it is actually important to go in with the best or not go in at all. Yeah. It's not worth having it. Yes, you may lose it and you may be up for costs again, but it's better than just walking in knowing you're going to lose it. Yeah. Guys, I know I often crowdfund for other people's cases, a couple times for myself, but this time it's really for me. I can't afford the $278,000, or more than $250,000 to have this fight, and I'm so grateful for each and every one of you that have donated till now, and those of you that can redonate or are going to donate to ensure that we can have these fights. None of this is possible without your help. AviLegalFund.com. Every dollar counts. Every dollar will help ensure that I will live to fight another day. AviLegalFund.com.